He was insecure physically, he was insecure sexually, he was insecure socially, he was insecure because he'd never been to a proper school. His real impulse was to make France great and to make it secure. Really, reading about Napoleon, it's like reading some of the greatest novels, that you actually read the story, but you think, hello, this is telling me something about life in general, and even sometimes about myself. There's a loss of aspiration. The idea of people wanting to educate themselves, wanting to acquire culture, to read great literature, to listen to the great music, to see the great art, has vanished. There's a counter trend of it's cool to look like a slob, behave like a slob, never read a book, watch crap movies, and that's why we get the sort of politicians we do.
Adam, you wrote this wonderful book on Napoleon. I enjoyed it thoroughly, but I wanted to start our discussion not talking about Napoleon's life necessarily, but to start off, why don't we just recap for the audience, for folks who have maybe heard Napoleon's name and maybe don't know the full story, why should people care about Napoleon? Why is Napoleon a character worth studying?
Principally because his life is almost a kind of lesson in what can happen in politics, and there are so many lessons to be learned from it, because it's complex, and he's a complex character, and he's not. Nothing is obvious about it, and at every point in it, you can relate to him and to the people around him as ordinary people. And while with a guy like Hitler, you can say, well, look, the guy's just a loon, or he's just evil, or whatever. Or Stalin, the guy's got a problem, and most dictators, or most people who do some of the kind of things that Napoleon got involved with, are fairly easily classified. Whereas Napoleon isn't. He was basically a nice guy, very insecure, socially insecure. He came from a colony, from an island, a colony of France. He was insecure physically, he was insecure sexually, he was insecure socially, he was insecure because he'd never been to a proper school. And even though he surmounted all these insecurities, they then led him into a kind of whirlpool of events and situations, which made him act well or badly, as you might think, and which had various consequences, some good, some bad. But because he was fundamentally a nice guy who meant well, it's much easier to derive lessons from him, because you can only learn if you can study a nice guy who does things that aren't necessarily very good. Because if it's a thug who does terrible things, well, you're not going to learn anything from that. And you can get into Napoleon because because there's so much about him, and he revealed a lot about himself. And so one can really, reading about Napoleon, it's like reading some of the greatest novels, that you actually read the story, but you think, hello, this is telling me something about life in general, and even sometimes about myself and how I react. And so he really is somebody who is worth reading about, even if you're not interested in history particularly, if you're not interested in the period, if you're not interested in law or anything like that, or even in politics. Because it is a sort of extraordinary, it's like his life is like, one of the great Greek dramas. What happens to a guy who gets caught up in a situation. In the Greek versions, there were gods there. In this case, it's European politics. Because he's born onto this little island, into a family that has ambitions. And it's an island on which, because it's small and very competitive, you can't stand still. You have to fight for the elbow room, literally, because their plots of land are so small and their living conditions are extraordinary. I mean, if you visit the Casa Bonaparte in Ajaccio today, it's about 5 times the size of it. There's no relation to what he was brought up in. And then he's sent off to France to make a career, and of course he falls into a kind of a rat race. Most of his the other cadets at his military school are from grander families. They've got more money. They can speak French. He can't speak French at the beginning, and so on. And then he gets over that by teaching himself everything, by really studying everything. But then he finds himself caught up in a revolutionary situation in which, again, if you don't go forward, you go back or you're trampled on. It's dog eat dog out there. And the moment he shows any intelligence or enterprise, he realizes he's a target. And the only thing to do in that situation is to, again, use your elbows and get ahead. He was endlessly defying assassination attempts. And there are these hysterical moments when great banquets are given for him because he's won all these victories, and he goes to them with a hard-boiled egg in his pocket and his own piece of bread and his own water and wine, because he won't touch anything that anybody else could possibly have spiked. And from then on, it's a bit like, the story, the fairy tale of the sorcerer's apprentice. You can't stop that machine. And even when he could begin to stop it, he can't, because by then his insecurities and his own fear of what might happen if he stops has developed into a paranoia, and he feels that unless he can, deliver more glory, give his people more splendor, that they will just reject him. So it really is the most extraordinary. You can almost read it as an abstraction, forgetting about the actual historical context. So, although the historical context is, in fact, fascinating. but there is this universal quality about it, which I think is the reason why he does fascinate so many people.
Right. Now, I was really fascinated at the beginning with this idea of this like dog eat dog world that you just described, where a lot of Europe, it seemed like, was constantly in battle and lines were being redrawn on maps all the time throughout the whole book, basically. Countries were being taken over and then they were taking over other countries. Are there good parallels you can draw to today's world where you kind of see an example of that happening? Because that is a very different picture from the political landscape, at least in much of the Western world today, where we've had most of the same maps for many decades, and there's relatively peaceful, conduct between a lot of the major countries. How do you kind of help people understand and really feel what it was like to be in Europe in that era?
It does have a great deal of relevance for today because, well, throughout the Middle Ages, there were lots of small countries, and right up to the beginning of the 18th century, um, there were some states would be called powers, and then there were a whole lot of states which were called second-rank powers, and then there would be smaller states, and they all had to be reckoned with. There was no big bully that was big enough to really. There were so many people that could be brought into a coalition to stop them. And an example I always use is this: that in the middle of the 17th century, the 1600s, the terrible 30 Years' War, which was fought over the geographical space of Germany, but involved almost every country in Europe. When it came to signing the peace, there were something like 112 interested parties. That meant, bigger states, smaller states, city-states, and so on, who were represented by something like 80 or 90 representatives, diplomats. And they forged something called the Peace of Westphalia, which set up a kind of security system where everybody respected everybody's sovereignty. And at the beginning of already at the end of the 17th century, some powers began to get bigger and rise in power and become more aggressive. And so instead of the 120 or whatever it was people represented at the Peace of Westphalia, at the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, barely 60 odd years later, there were only 8 powers represented by 5 negotiators. And at the end of the 7 Years' War, another 50 years on, there were, I think, 5 powers represented by 3. And so it goes on until at the end of the Second World War, you've got essentially everything was decided by Roosevelt and Stalin. 2 people decide. Because what had happened was that gradually all the smaller states were being eaten up during the 18th century. Russia, which was completely outside Europe at the beginning in 1700, um, by took over more and more territory. And in the period between 17, 1770 and 1812, it had moved 600 kilometers further into Europe. It had pushed its boundaries and also taken over the whole of Alaska and set up colonies in California, in what's now California. So there was this tremendous expansionist urge. And the minute one power starts expanding, the others feel they have to expand. And so Prussia, from being a very small power, it quadrupled in size in the space of 50 years, which is absurd because, and so everybody then felt, and of course, Britain suddenly had this great big empire, and so although it was still a small island, it had this huge landmass. And then, of course, they fought over America, but in fact, the States, but it still had Canada and a whole lot of India and so on. So it was also expanding like mad. And in fact, France was extremely threatened because of the expansion of Russia and Prussia and Austria, which occupied half of Italy, and various other countries. And that's why Louis XIV started building up the power of France. But that was very much weakened in the mid-century wars. And so there was a real power struggle between, by the 1780s, there was, and the second rank powers like Denmark or the Netherlands or Sweden, Poland, they were all either disappearing or being marginalized. Portugal, Spain became really no longer at all powerful. And by the 1780s, you had really a real race for dominion. And Russia resented British ambitions in India and British domination of the seas. Britain resented Russia's expansion on the continent, on the European continent. Austria and France were terrified of Prussia's expansion and Russia's expansion and Britain's hegemony at sea. So you've got this sense of enormous insecurity, which very similar to what we've got at the moment, where there's there's paranoia. You've got Russia was regarded until 3 years ago as the second greatest military power, is now terrified and looking for allies wherever it can find them. China, which is vast and could swamp us all, is behaving like as though they were threatened and rearming and showing off their military hardware. There is a kind of a rat race for domination based on, above all, a sense of insecurity.
Do you think that there's an element of that insecurity, like Napoleon's personal insecurity? Do you think that was somewhat inspired by the insecurity that people in France were feeling at the time? Do you think there's some relationship there, or was this like just a deeply personal insecurity that was unique to him?
Well, he had his own insecurity, but also he felt the insecurity of France, which it was tremendously weakened by the French Revolution. Well, it had been weakened economically because it had always been in an undeclared economic war with Britain over the colonies, but also Britain was, with the Industrial Revolution, was suddenly had become the industrial powerhouse and could sell anything into Europe more cheaply than anything anybody could make in Europe. So it was a threat. And then France's rather ill-advised intervention in the American rebellion against Britain, which was a question of self-respect, really, and trying to rebuild their morale, was actually a financial disaster because that really ruined what was left of France's finances, and that's what provoked the revolution in 1789. And frankly, France was very, very weak, and then weakened by all this revolutionary turmoil, which created unstable governments. And while at first they could destabilize other powers simply by the force of the revolutionary ideas which her armies were spreading, which destabilized some of its immediate enemies. And then by the brilliance of Napoleon's actions in Italy in the 1790s, but it was still extremely vulnerable. And his real impulse was to make France great and to make it secure. And the whole thing of dominating Europe, it wasn't because he wanted to dominate the whole of Europe. He was trying to install a security system which would mean that France was invulnerable. And he, he made, well, I think one of his greatest mistakes was, in the strategic sense, was that in 1807, when he had defeated Austria and Prussia and Russia, defeated the coalition that had tried to destroy him, instead of choosing as his then foreign minister, Talleyrand insisted he should, instead of choosing as his strategic ally Austria, he chose Russia. The whole point was that over the past 100 years, the German lands, there was no such thing as, there wasn't a German state. There were lots and lots of little states. And about 1,500 of them. And that was very useful because if Germany became one state, it would be extremely powerful. It had huge resources, educated manpower. It was the powerhouse and the center of Europe. And the whole idea was that it should remain it should remain split up. And the only way to keep this, maintain this, was that the surrounding powers should prevent any of the other surrounding powers from getting undue influence or starting to gobble up bits of it. And here the problem was Prussia, which was doing just that. And the other problem was Russia, because the Tsar of Russia, Alexander I, was entirely German, because his forefathers had been marrying Germans. And so he was related to almost every single ruling prince in Germany. And Austria feared Russian influence and Prussian influence, and those were the two that threatened Napoleon and France. And the natural alliance should have been Austria and France, instead of which Napoleon chose, he became rather interested by this idea of being great friends with Alexander I and having the Empire of the East and the Empire of the West. It sort of, in his imagination, it went back to ancient Rome and so on. And that was a major mistake, because it then meant that Russia became a superpower. And that meant that in the 19th century, Germany had to become a superpower as well, which it did when it became unified in the 1870s, in 1870. And then there was the big problem. Europe became dominated by great powers, and small countries like Denmark or Sweden or whatever had nothing to say at all in the power game. And we've reached a similar situation now.
I want to give the audience an understanding of Napoleon's early years and those first battles in Italy, where he kind of like showed up on the scene and made himself known to people in France as like someone who could lead an army. What was so special about Napoleon's his education, his early years, his development as a general that made him so successful in those early battles? And we can go from there.
Well, he had an exceptional brain. He could remember everything. He could calculate things. He was very quick, very, very agile. And when he embarked on anything, he would study. And he could think outside the box. His first military breakthrough came at the siege of Toulon. Toulon was a French port in the southern Mediterranean, and this was the revolution was still going on, and the anti-French coalition landed the British Navy and Spanish Navy both landed a British and Spanish force and linked up with a whole lot of French royalists in Toulon. And the French revolutionaries sent an army which then besieged it on the landward side. And Toulon has these, it's like a sort of gut, it's a great natural harbour. And all these British and Spanish ships were in the harbour. And their troops were on land. And Napoleon turned up, he was still a captain then, and there was nobody to command any artillery there. Indeed, there wasn't much artillery, but as he was an artillery captain, they said, okay, look, will you set up an artillery unit for us, because we'll need this. So he went around finding any old cannons he could find, he requisitioned things, he would set up workshops to rebuild guns and so on. But more importantly, he then realized that there was a promontory going out into the sea. If you could which had old forts there, which the Brits had occupied. And he said that if you could capture those and put some guns up there, then you could bombard all their ships and they would have to evacuate, because otherwise they'd all be sunk. And when he presented this plan, they all said, no, it's too far-fetched. Anyway, he went ahead, and of course it worked. And he sank a whole lot of ships. Also, he heated cannonballs till they were red hot, so that when they landed on a wooden ship, they would set fire to it. And the whole thing was cleared up in no time at all. And so he was very quickly promoted and became a general. But then the other thing that brought him to notice was that when there was trouble in a minor insurrection in Paris against the Legal Assembly, he happened to be there without a job, and they said, help us protect the National Assembly. And so he pulled together a few people, immediately got hold again of some cannon, and set up a defense, and put an end to the insurrection. But and at that stage, people began to fear him, and so they sent him off to command the army of Italy, which was hardly had any uniforms. Morale was rock bottom. They didn't have boots. They didn't have hats, and they weren't being fed properly. And well, he turned up and first of all said to the local authorities of places like Nice and so on, unless you feed them, I'm going to send them to come and loot your city. So he managed to feed them. He boosted their morale, but before leaving, he spent 2 weeks locked away, and he'd taken every single map of northern Italy he could find in the French archives. He borrowed every book on campaigns fought in Italy from the 15th century onwards, and he locked himself up for 2 weeks and lay on the floor on these maps, reading these books, making a note of where the rivers were, where they were fordable, where there were bridges, how wide the bridges were, where there were mountain passes that you could actually get a cannon through, and so on. And so he was very, very well prepared and used the terrain to brilliant effect, moving very, very swiftly. And he energized his men. He said, look, you're all hungry here and you haven't got clothes or boots, but over those mountains over there are plenty of clothes and boots. You can take them off the Austrians once you've defeated them, and there's plenty of food and wine. It's land flowing with milk and honey. And so that motivated them, and he managed to win some very brilliant but quite small victories over, quite small numbers of troops, because we're talking about battles where there were 10,000 on one side and 15,000 on the other. But the other thing that Napoleon was he was a great propagandist, and so he would issue bulletins for the benefit of his troops, in which he would praise them, saying, that they were better than the legions of Julius Caesar, that they had achieved miracles, and that he flattered them. And this excited them. And he did it with reference to the great heroes of that, it was Achilles and Ulysses and all that. And all these young men thought, wow, let's go. The other thing is he wrote bulletins which he sent back to France, the government, in which he lied unashamedly, magnifying his successes, saying that he'd taken thousands of prisoners, which he hadn't, captured cannons, which he hadn't, captured standards, which he hadn't, inflated everything, and they were written like a kind of exciting, story of daring do. And of course, governments, and the government back, the Directory in Paris, the revolutionary government, was very weak and unpopular. And there's nothing that makes governments more popular than reports of fantastic military success abroad. And so they published these things everywhere. They would paste them up on street corners. And it took them some time before it dawned on them that actually they were helping to create a national hero, whom they then tried to diminish. But he was brilliant militarily, by dint of hard work, studying the maps, looking at the figures, thinking fast, and acting decisively. And he won some extraordinary battles, and managed to create an aura about himself that even the enemy began to fear. There's a wonderful quote by one Austrian general. Well, actually, he wasn't Austrian. He was a Piedmontese, anyway, on the other side, who said that this man seemed to be like one of the heroes of antiquity who could cut through mountains with his sword. And a kind of mass hysteria got going about his invincibility, supported also with visually. He commissioned dozens of prints and paintings showing these great heroics. There's many of you will probably have an image of Napoleon on the bridge of Arcole. He's got a sword in one hand and the standard of France in the other, and he's turning to encourage his men to follow him across the bridge. Well, he never got within 100 meters of the bridge because the artillery on the other side, when they opened fire, killed almost everybody around him and dumped him into a very deep ditch from which he was only pulled out by a sergeant. But never mind, the narrative was there, the image was there, and that turned him into a hero. And all his great victories subsequently, like Austerlitz, and were again, he looked at the maps. At Austerlitz, he rode over the terrain which he wanted to fight the battle on about 3 times with his staff and his generals, saying, look, this is where it's going to be fought, because we're going to draw the Russians and the Austrians in, and you're going to go back there and we'll destroy them here. And so everybody knew what they were doing. And later, he got lazy, and he had other things to do, like run a country and create a new legal system, a new educational system, and so on. and he didn't pay as much attention and relied much more on brute force. And that's where things began to, his victories became much less brilliant, and in some cases, even though he won them, he didn't really deserve to.
Where do you think Napoleon got that knack for self-promotion? And there were paintings, all sorts of paintings made of his battles, and this propaganda machine was running, and Napoleon's legend was growing. Where did he first get that, and how important was that to France's success? That, like, was this propaganda machine starting to tilt battles in his favor without him having to focus on battles as the years went on?
I think there are two things. You must bear in mind that his generation, particularly in France, but not only, had been brought up on. It was the end of the Enlightenment. The first part of the Enlightenment was about rational thought. Let's get rid of all the medieval superstition and this and that and religion. Let's get rid of that. And you've got Voltaire and co. saying, no, only things that are understandable and rational are good. And so that was all very good. But by the 1770s and 80s, there was a new movement came along, of whom Rousseau, in a way, is the obviously salient figure, saying, well, no, rationality is all very well, but actually feeling and emotion are even more important. And it was the beginnings of the Romantic movement. And the idea was what's really important, and it was in a way a new religion, that instead of being a good boy on earth so that God would love you and you'd be happy in paradise, there was the idea that religion was pointless, but self-perfection came through fulfilling your talents, fulfilling yourself. I think it was Madame de Stael, the Baroness de Stael, who wrote that this generation began to think that if they tried harder and harder, they would, in the end, take flight. And so, it was also the period in which the fashion of the times rediscovered ancient Greece and Rome, and hence you've got neoclassical architecture coming in, new forms of dress and behavior and so on. And of course it was all predicated on the heroes of antiquity and the idea that these great heroes were almost demigods, and that if you really did fulfill yourself by achieving extreme things of perfection and fulfilled yourself, you would become one of the elect. That's when the word genius stopped being used as it had been before, simply to denote somebody very clever or very good at something, to denote somebody with almost transcendent qualities or abilities. They were all, that generation, were all brought up on, Plutarch's lives of the heroes of antiquity. And this was their Bible, their book of saints. Napoleon was very much affected by this and did believe in that to begin with. He became more cynical later on. But at that time in his youth, he did believe in in the fact that if you really tried and you pushed yourself to do the great deed, that you could actually surmount physical difficulties. So part of it was himself, um, within himself, and part of it was also the spirit of the times. That people wanted on the other side as well. I mean, Tsar Alexander I desperately wanted to win a battle himself. That's why he turned up at Austerlitz. All his advisors said kings shouldn't be in a battle because if you lose, you'll be blamed. Whereas if your army loses, the generals will be blamed. And anyway, you could get killed, which would be very bad for the state. You're supposed to sit on the throne and rule. But no, Alexander and co, they all wanted to be on the front line, brandishing their swords, saying, I'm winning this battle. Even the British Prince Regent, the future George IV, he actually began to, he sort of talked himself into thinking that he had won the Battle of Waterloo, and he hadn't been anywhere near it. So it was a trend, an aspiration. Like in the 60s, everybody wanted to be a rock star. That was your transcendent. That's what made you special. So that was a very major part of it, but also as a result, society expected its leaders to take flight and to be almost superhuman. And they wanted idols. They chucked God out of the public sphere with all his saints and martyrs, and so they invented new saints and martyrs. Jacques-Louis David's wonderful painting of Marat having been stabbed in his bath is a contemporary martyr picture, just like the ones that were in every church of saints being martyred. And there were several, he painted several martyrdoms. So it was a kind of a faith. And the belief in it did inspire those young men to charge into a volley of cannon shot without fear, because they felt that even if they were killed, they would go down into posterity as heroes. It was a very, very powerful drum that generation was fed on. So it worked both ways. It fed on him from the outside, but it also, of course, chimed with his insecurities, because it was the one way he could rise above that and stop feeling inferior.
Now, all the other countries in Europe at the time, it seemed that they were ruled by royalty, or that like Napoleon was coming at this from a point of not having royal blood and being inferior in some respects. And as the revolution drew to a close, then he kind of assumed this role as not only the general leading the French army, but also as the leader of France. How did the country of France like learn to accept that here's this person who's not royalty? They're successful on the battlefield, but how did they come to decide that he was the right person to lead the whole country? Because that's a totally different job than just leading the military.
Well, they had had at least 15 years of absolutely hopeless government. The last years of the Bourbon royal government were a shambles. The economy was a mess. The institutions were no longer working. There was huge social discontent for all sorts of reasons. Then comes the revolution, brilliant new ideals, and everybody gets terribly excited about it. But then they all start arguing about how to run the country. They kept trying to invent new constitutions, and there were power struggles between the left and the right, and then you've got Robespierre and the terror coming in, and everything was terribly unstable. And ordinary people pretty quickly get fed up with that sort of thing. They want a properly run country. They want strong government. And so they were delighted when he seized power and immediately brought law and order, and immediately started building sensible, solid institutions. A new parliament, which worked mainly because it did more or less what he told it to do. But there was still an insecurity because the whole of Europe, which, as you say, was ruled by monarchies, felt that France was still a centre of revolutionary thought, which fundamentally threatened their existence ideologically, and that it should be extinguished. It should be simply, the revolution should be stamped out like a fire. And the Brits particularly kept on either assisting or planning assassinations of him to bring back the chaos so that they could form a coalition and invade France and put the old Bourbons back and reduce it. And it was felt that because he was the symbol of stability, all those in France who wanted stability, and that was the majority, particularly after he had allowed the Catholic Church to start operating again and had started treating noblemen who'd been thrown out by the revolution, saying, okay, if you're French, you can come and take your place in this country, your rightful place, and it's fine. And so he was the linchpin of this new security after 15 years of chaos and bloodshed. And so everybody wanted to perpetuate these. And people were terrified that if one of these assassins manages to kill him, then the whole country would be plunged again into chaos. And there were two things that came together. One was to anchor his position into as it were, make it permanent. So even if he were to be killed, there would be a succession. And secondly, to calm down and placate all those monarchical powers all over Europe by turning him into a monarch. Because obviously a monarch with a court was not going to start the revolution anywhere else and start overthrowing thrones. So that was the thinking behind, first of all, making him first consul for life, and then emperor. And the idea was that it was hoped that he would produce an heir, and then it meant that even if he was killed, there would be continuity. The great old French principle of le roi est mort, vive le roi. The kings died, long live the king, because there was already a new king. The moment the king died, his successor was king. He didn't have to be crowned or anything chosen, he was king. So, there was that principle on the one hand, and the idea that there might be acceptance from Europe, from the others, because European monarchs would feel more relaxed about signing peace with a French monarch. So it was really logical. And yes, there was vanity and show involved, but that wasn't the guiding principle.
How did Napoleon go from, it seemed like in the early years, he was this liberator and he brought in peace and calm to France. And then in the later years, it started to tilt towards him being viewed as an oppressor and almost like rekindling some of the earlier chaos. How did that transition happen? Like, because he initially was aiming for peace, right? He was hoping to get it. He sort of got it for a few years, and then it seemed like that all unwound. Can you walk me through how that all happened?
Well, yes, I mean, he did want peace right until the end, but there was the problem was, and I said at the beginning, that having made France great again and stabilized it, he he was terribly aware of its vulnerabilities. The point is that the further you extend yourself, it's the same with a business. The more shops you open, or the more coffee shops your chain opens, the more vulnerable you become. Okay, you become more and more powerful, but actually you're more easily, something goes wrong, it really goes wrong. Whereas if you've got your one coffee shop, and there's a bit of a places you can batten down the hatches and somehow carry on and whatever. So he, by expanding, he had laid himself open, and so he kept trying to put in place security systems. So in Italy, which France was always vulnerable to Austrian invasion through Italy, so he created a French-dominated state in northern Italy. Then he created client states in Germany and allied states to act as buffers against aggression, and so on. But the trouble was that the one really, the one power which couldn't afford to make peace with Napoleon on Napoleon's terms was Britain, because Britain existed on the basis of fundamentally having this great colonial empire which supplied it with raw materials, foodstuffs, everything. And it had this great industrial powerhouse, and it could produce things nobody else could produce. But that was all useless unless you could sell it to somebody. And unless you could sell it on the continent, the whole thing, the whole economy, fell apart. Now, if you allowed Britain to sell what it wanted um, on the continent, it would simply flood the market with better made, cheaper goods and dominate the whole thing and put, for instance, the French textile industry out of business. And so there was, this was the big problem, that France wasn't going to be, when they did have peace, that brief, as you say, that brief window of the last of our year, the Peace of Amiens, there was supposed to be, it was signed, and the British had understood that there would be then a commercial treaty signed after that, which would give them access. And Napoleon didn't want a commercial treaty because he knew he was trying to build up France's industrial base, and he knew that would be completely undermined by British imports. And then he made the absolute fundamental mistake, I mean, that really was a thing, of saying, okay, he was going to up the ante in his trade war by making all his allies, which included the whole of the European mainland by then, and Russia, close their ports to British ships and not let in any British imports in. And that was fatal, because what it meant was that he made life unbearable for everybody on the continent, and he became the bully saying, no, you can't import this, and no, you can't export that. And, you know, Spain wasn't allowed to export its fruits to England. You know, others couldn't export their wine to, you know, the whole thing. And so from being the liberator, he became the policeman of Europe. And possibly his greatest failing was he had many of the attributes of a psychopath. And as you know, psychopaths aren't necessarily evil. They can be, you know, perfectly benevolent people. And one of the absolutely salient fundamental things of a psychopath is the absence of the quality of empathy. That's to say, the inability to put yourself in another guy's shoes. So you tread on his toe without really thinking that it might hurt him. You know, it doesn't occur to you. And so he declares this, he creates this continental blockade without really putting himself in the place of, you know, say people in Russia who didn't have an industry at all and had to import. Where were they going to import a pair of scissors from? It was only in Birmingham that you could get, you know, that they made a decent pair of scissors. And you know, and so he was basically putting everybody into a kind of lockdown and putting them on a kind of fast. And he didn't understand that this wasn't going to work, because the people, you have to, and actually all his treaties, he always pushed people too far and put them in a position where they would have to come back and make war again, because the treaty they'd signed was too harsh or cut across some of their natural interests. And he then became, as you say, the roles were reversed until, certainly until about 1807, actually ordinary common people throughout most of Europe welcomed when they heard that Napoleon's armies, French armies, were advancing on their country, because they thought that they would be liberated, that good things would come to them, and good things did come, because the minute he occupied the territory, he would abolish all sorts of taxes and impediments and guilds and restrictions. You know, he opened all the ghettos and that people got rights, and censorship was removed, and so on. So people welcomed them. And of course, the roles became reversed because suddenly he was using his armies to impose restrictions of all sorts. And you know, and again, this is one of the sort of lessons that reading about Napoleon can teach you and me, which is, you know, just take stock of where you're while trying to pursue your advantage or your aims. Are you treading so far on those of others that they will naturally feel bound to come back and get you one day. So it's an extraordinary story of how you know, it's almost a sort of textbook in what to watch out for. You know, whether you're in business, in politics, or in just normal human relationships, as you progress.
That's a great lesson. I wonder, you know, you talk about Napoleon lacking in empathy, and I wonder if that lack of empathy, on the one hand, contributed to him being an incredible general on the battlefield, where, you know, you might not want empathy, you might want to completely destroy the enemy, but then on the other hand, when he's in charge of running the country, it may be a negative trait to have, where you actually have to negotiate and you have to be peaceful with other countries. You have some level of like diplomacy and some, like, it feels like this character trait without empathy made him much better in the battlefield and much worse as a emperor or leader of France. Is that fair to say?
No, I don't think that is true, actually, because he was certainly not violent in battle. He was not. He was not callous with his men or anybody else's men. He didn't like. I mean, didn't particularly like killing or seeing a lot of dead. And indeed, when things really got much worse with improved cannon, you know, people had more cannon and bigger armies, and so by 1809, in that campaign, the Wagram campaign, he was really distressed riding over the battlefield, seeing the carnage. He didn't like that. So I don't think he thought that way. I think he, no, I think he thought, I think he was pretty much convinced most of the time that what he was doing was the most rational and benevolent thing you could do. And, you know, he thought, well, no, they should like this because, you know, I think this is right, you know, and logic tells me it's right, and you know, and I'm now working on his involvement in Spain, and that's a perfect example of he went to extraordinary pains to get all the technicalities of putting his brother on the throne and it was going to bring happiness to Spain because he was going to bring enlightenment and get rid of the Inquisition, which everybody wanted to get rid of, and open up everything and trade and everything. And he couldn't understand why they didn't like what he was doing. Admittedly, it would have been quite difficult to put yourself in the minds of a large section of the Spanish people at that time, because they were their ideas of what they were fighting for was extremely confused. So, but he didn't even really attempt. He got a few people to go out there and report to him, and of course they said pretty much what they thought he wanted to hear. But he believed he was doing the right thing and bringing happiness to people. And yes, he then, towards the end, if somebody really got in his way or didn't understand the great benefits, refused the great benefits he was doing them, they were punks, and he felt they should be dealt with harshly.
So, you talked about some of the errors Napoleon made and especially in the trade agreements with trying to close out Britain from the rest of Europe. Is that where Napoleon's downfall really began? And where do you think, when do you think the country of France started to realize that Napoleon's downfall and France's downfall was beginning? Was it later on? Because he had this ability to kind of like paper over his mistakes and make everyone kind of, believe that he was doing a better job than sometimes he was. So was there a disconnect there, do you think, between when the downfall really started and when everyone else realized, uh-oh, we might be in some trouble here?
It's difficult to tell, but on the whole, the disconnect was that he still thought, he was convinced that the French people wanted more and more of the glory. And they loved the glory of the early days. But really, by the time of, after he'd beaten the Russians at Friedland in 1807, by then, even many of the generals were tired. People wanted peace and stability, and on the whole, in France, they did get stability, and things worked, and the infrastructure that he was rebuilding, it's extraordinary. I mean, the thousands and thousands of miles of proper roads he built, the telegraph, the posting service, the river service, the canals, cleaning up cities, in the embankments of Paris, new harbours, institutions, schooling, the schooling system, the justice system, the prison system. Everything was reformed, and people really appreciated it, and they just sort of wished he would, there weren't any more wars, because they felt that was enough. But his insecurity meant that he felt he had to carry on. And of course, they didn't abandon him. The real tragedy is that when he was on the retreat from Moscow, a group of generals, a fairly insignificant group, decided, tried to carry out a coup d'etat. what they did was, in the middle of the night, they erupted into the sort of bedrooms or, onto the houses and knocked people up in the middle of the night, brandishing forged documents and things, saying the emperor has been killed in Russia. And so they managed to we must form a new government and take control. And these people, a lot of them woken up in the middle of the night or surprised early in the morning, went along with it, and they got quite far before they were rounded up and then shot. What got Napoleon, it really shattered him, was by then he had an heir. He had a son and heir, and when he got back to Paris, he called all the ministers and the people responsible together, and he said, "You idiots, don't you realise?" Because what had really hurt him was that when these people came into people's bedrooms or studies saying "L'Empereur est mort," they should have shouted "Vive l'Empereur," because there was the heir. No need to form a new government. No, everything's fine. And it never occurred to any of them to do it because, well, first of all, they'd been through the revolution, and that habit had died. And secondly, and what got him was that, and he lectured them. He said, "Don't you realise that's the only real asset of monarchy? Is that there is this absolute continuity and the stability that comes with it." And what got him personally was that he thought, and they probably didn't shout "Vive l'Empereur" because they'd fallen out of the habit. They weren't courtiers. The Bourbons had been got rid of and discredited over 20 years earlier, and it didn't occur to them to do that. But he took it as meaning that his assumption, and probably he took it personally, saying that, if I hadn't been who I am, then they would have shouted "Vive l'Empereur," but I wasn't just grand enough. And it prevented him from saving his throne in 1813 and 1814, when he had endless opportunities to make peace. And the most important member of the coalition against him, Austria, who was essential to bringing him down, kept saying, because the last thing the Austrians wanted was to have Napoleonic power and influence in Germany replaced by Russian power and influence in Germany, because that threatened Austria directly in the Balkans and elsewhere, and in Germany. And the Austrian Chancellor Metternich kept begging him, saying, "Look, please, please, please make peace now and make a few concessions, and then we can see later, but, save yourself." And he said this to his own people, and he said it to Metternich, and he said it several times. He said, "I can't make peace in this situation when I'm being beaten. Your hereditary monarchs, they can lose 20 battles and still come back to their capitals and be loved by their peoples. I can't, because I'm an upstart general." And he repeated that several times. And his wife and his advisors and even Josephine, his ex-wife, wrote to him saying, look, your people love you. All they want is for you to come home and make peace, and we can all go back to being happy and well and all that. And his insecurity meant he was frightened. He was absolutely, he couldn't stomach the idea of coming back to Paris, having given up land, given up a bit of his glory, and not ended on a high. And it was tragic. And he said to I forget which, I think it was his foreign ministers, who said, look, go and make peace. He said, what, you're asking me to take my pants down and let my bottom be whipped by these people? There was no question of them. All he had to do was to say, okay, I will no longer dominate this bit of Germany, and I will go give back this province or that province to whoever. France would still have been the most important. And had he made peace, then Britain would have been forced to make peace, because it could no longer have any influence on the continent.
That's a very difficult task to ask someone who is so successful to stop. Like at a certain point to say, enough's enough, you've accomplished your task, that's it. And you mentioned even the idea of like a business, right? Like if you have a coffee shop and you want a second chain and a third and a fourth and a fifth, and all of a sudden you're Starbucks and you got 100,000 coffee shops, and it's like the only thing you can think of doing is making that next shop and expanding. How do you rein that in? It feels like it's almost human nature to say, I want to continue expanding, but are there any people who have, successfully thread that needle and said, I'm really succeeding, but now enough's enough and I'm going to stop?
Yes, well, here is yet another good reason for reading about Napoleon's life, because it shows you, it makes you reflect on where you should accept your shortcomings. I accept that I can't go on writing hoping to get that bestseller that's going to sell more books than so-and-so, or more books than the other one, or get the Nobel Prize or this prize or that prize. It's a salutary lesson. You learn to accept that there are limits, and you can still be well thought of and well regarded if you've written some very good, very fine, very intelligent books which teach people a lot of things and give a lot of pleasure, which haven't sold, 20 million or whatever. And indeed, some pretty rotten books have sold an awful lot. And no, his life is full of lessons for us all in every walk of life. And there's that's why it has some of the elements of Greek tragedy, because there's the great rise and the hubris, and then there's the fall. But then there's this extraordinary final stage in his life, after Waterloo, after everything, and he's dumped on this island in the middle of the Atlantic, where he's not allowed to. It was appalling. It was so illegal because at first they said he was a prisoner of war. When he pointed out, well, prisoners of war are released when the war's over. Um, then they said, well, he was a criminal. Okay, but criminals in prison can see their family. They can have visits. He wasn't allowed visits. Criminals are allowed to correspond. He wasn't allowed to send any letters and so on. So he was treated with unbelievable meanness and petty-mindedness by the Brits. And the number of troops guarding him, the amount of expenditure, because there was a whole naval station there with ships circumnavigating the island, one going in one direction and the other one going clockwise and the other one anti-clockwise. How the hell they expected him? How the hell they thought he might try to escape is not known. But anyway, he then realized that he was going to have his revenge. And he had brought with him a small number of people. And he was aware of the fact that he dictated his memoirs to one, but he was also aware that his small talk over dinner and while going for walks would be recorded and written down and with time published by the others, because they were stuck out there for years, and the only way they could ever get some money out of it would be by publishing their memoirs. And so he dropped all these thoughts in their ears that would then be disseminated, and he cast himself in the role of a martyr. And he provoked the British government, who is an extraordinarily petty and silly man. He provoked him into being more and more petty and silly and more mean-minded than ever, which was all recorded. And there was a very sympathetic British admiral was posted to command this station, whose wife rather liked Napoleon, and they would meet and have tea and chats. And one day he said to her, he said, "I've worn the imperial crown of France. I've worn the Iron Crown of Italy. But you, the British, are placing on my head the greatest crown of them all, the crown of our Saviour, the crown of thorns." And he created a cult from that island of himself. There were, I forget how many Italian and French and German poets, on hearing the news, sat down and wrote odes and poems about the tragedy of his death, and sublimating him into this tremendous martyr for humanity. So he got his revenge in the end. The fact is, we're still talking about and writing about him today.
It was a fascinating book, and this is a fascinating conversation. I just want to finish off with one final thought about, you studied Napoleon, you've studied his life, but you're living here in the 21st century. And when you look around, and this could be in any domain, politics, business, internationally, doesn't matter. Do you see any people that sort of resemble Napoleon in either his ambition or his character or some of the conquests? Do you see any parallels to what's happening in the world today?
No, all I can say is that you think about Napoleon and then you look at the world leaders who are trying to um, uh, you know, elevate themselves to that sort of status. You're just, I mean, they're such total primitive, uneducated, um, idiots lacking completely in any style, in any sense of beauty or real benevolence towards their peoples. I mean, it's really, really sad. Uh, every single modern dictator is just about personal power and money and whatever. And if you go out into business and you look at the Musks and and all those people, I mean, they're pretty pathetic. Okay, some of them give a lot of money to charity, but there's no style there. There's no inspiring idea of doing something with that money. It's one thing. It's all very well giving to charity, but Napoleon wouldn't have given to charity. He would have, created an enterprise that would have transformed lives, and it's really, we've I mean he is, by comparison, he just shines as a man of exceptional refinement in it for all his crudity, because he did pick his nose and like eating with his fingers sometimes, don't we all, and could be extremely brusque and rude and so on. But the refinement of his mind and his initiatives and okay, the structures he put in place in France, authoritarian. I don't particularly like that, but they work, and actually they've been adopted in in most European countries to some extent, and in many of the former colonies of France, and not only, because they work, and his cultural legacy is vast. No, it's very, very sad, and that I mean, there's next to Napoleon, all the great captains, well, forgetting about world leaders, but even the captains of industry and are just just really sort of primitive pygmies, nobodies.
Do you think we will see another person that resembles some of the traits and some of the style and some of the, the things that you admired about Napoleon? Do you think that that comes back at some point, or are we on this descending trajectory where the leaders become less and less admirable and less interesting people over time?
Yes, I think we are going down on the thing for a very simple reason that the popular trend amongst the overwhelming majority of people, certainly in most of the world, is there's a loss of aspiration. The idea of people wanting to educate themselves, wanting to acquire culture, to read the great literature, to listen to the great music, to see the great art, has vanished. It's people actually there's a counter trend of it's called to look like a slob, behave like a slob, never read a book, mm, watch crap movies, talk as primitive way as you can, and so on. And that's why we get the sort of politicians we do, because a, any person who's a bit more cultivated just simply laughed at is considered to be a lightweight and not tough enough and not gung ho enough about things. And, so I fear not.
Well, your book really inspired me. It made me think about. I now view the world in a different light. I felt like my aspirations grew overnight, kind of reading the book and just understanding what an incredible life Napoleon did live, and I felt like I was in the Napoleonic era, and I actually got to experience it myself. So I really appreciate you putting all the time and effort into writing that book. I'll leave a link for people who are tuning into this conversation in the description. Where can folks go to learn more about you and your work?
Well, I just have a website which just lists my books and things, and I occasionally put up where I'm going to be speaking, or when a new book's coming out, or it's being translated into or appearing in another language. But I don't really, and I'm afraid I don't do WhatsApps and Facebooks or any of these things. I can't find the time. I'm so busy reading.
Fair enough. I'll include a link to your website in the description. But thank you so much for taking the time to chat. I learned a lot.
Well, it's been a pleasure.